This Mac Mini costs $600, same as a mid-range phone. So what if I told you that a $600 Mac Mini not only outperforms Windows PCs and Windows laptops at its price point, pretty significantly by the way, but it also outperforms Apple's M2 MacBook Air, which costs $1,200 double, and Apple's 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro, which costs $1,300. Well, we're going to run not 5, not 10, but 15, actually 16 different tests to see how powerful Apple's cheapest Mac really is. Starting off with a disk speed test. So we ran this test using AJA disk speed and a 16GB 4K file. So just looking at these results compared to the M2 base MacBook Air and the M2 base MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini had the highest read. And when it comes to, again, the MacBook Air, the Mac Mini had 100 megabytes per second faster write and close to 100 megabytes per second faster read. Still, these speeds are a far cry from what we get on the 16-inch 1TB models of the MacBook Pros, which are Apple's highest performing SSDs. We then tested the actual transfer speed using an external SSD with 2 folders full of video files and 18 gigabytes in total. So we transferred all of that onto the internal storage, and this is where things started getting weird. You see, the Mac Mini only took 28 seconds. The M2 MacBook Air took 1 minute and 7 seconds, same as the M2 MacBook Pro. So how could the Mac Mini be so fast when in the SSD speed test that we've seen before, it was just as slow as the M2 Air and the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro? Well, this is likely caused by the SSD's cache. So every SSD has a super fast portion inside of it where things get copied initially and then they get transferred slowly to the main SSD portion. Just to give you guys an example, Samsung's 980 NVMe drive, 500 gigabytes model, that one has a cache of 100 gigabytes. So the remaining 400 gigabytes are much slower, meaning that once that 100 gigabyte gets full, everything would be much slower. So for a 256 gigabyte drive, we likely have 50 gigabytes at most, so probably 30 or so when it comes to the M2 Mac Mini. And we can see this when we run AJA disk speed, but this time with a 64 gigabyte file. You'll see that eventually the speeds will end up dropping significantly. On these low-end machines, as long as you're working with small files, everything will be pretty fast. It's just that when you're working with large files, that's when you'll really notice a massive hit in transfer speeds. Then we tested the CPU performance with Cinebench. As you probably know, all of these machines have an M2 chip with 8 cores, out of which 4 are performance cores and 4 are efficiency cores. The main difference between the M2 Mac Mini, M2 Air, and M2 13-inch Pro is that the Air doesn't have a fan. The 13-inch MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini do, but the Mac Mini is of course bigger, the fan is larger and also more powerful, so the question is, will this actually impact performance? Well, in our 10 minutes Cinebench run, the Mac Mini definitely scored the highest, but the difference wasn't as much as I expected. In fact, the difference between the Mac Mini and the MacBook Air was only 7.68%. So what about the temperatures? Well, we measured these after a 5 minutes Cinebench run, and the M2 Mac Mini was at 79 degrees, so really good. The M2 MacBook Air was at 105, and the M2 MacBook Pro was at 102. So yeah, the difference in temperatures between the Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro was very significant. The Mac Mini definitely has the best cooling system out of the 3. So how will this thermal system impact real-world usage? Well, we started off with Lightroom. We imported 228 images of various sizes and formats from RAWs to TIFFs up to 80 megapixels in size. So some of these were just massive. The M2 Mac Mini took 40 seconds to import, the M2 MacBook Air took 37, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 31. So the Mac Mini was actually the slowest one here. Very strange. Then we've applied a bunch of effects and filters to one image and pasted all of those onto the remaining 227 images. The Mac Mini took 1 minute and 15 seconds, the M2 MacBook Air took 1 minute, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 1 minute and 1 second. So the Mac Mini was once again slower, which shouldn't really happen as this app, Lightroom, is already optimized for the M2 chip, which is inside all of these machines. So what's actually happening? Well, we then ran a full export test. So we exported all of these edited 228 images to full resolution, because this is really when the systems will be pushed to the max, so hopefully we'll now see a big improvement when it comes to the Mac Mini's performance. And that is exactly what happens. The M2 Mac Mini took 15 minutes and 45 seconds, the M2 MacBook Air took 30 minutes and 36 seconds, so literally twice as long, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 17 minutes and 25 seconds. So the Mac Mini was 1.1 times faster than a 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro, and 1.94 times faster than the M2 MacBook Air, as it has, of course, better cooling and it can sustain its performance for much longer. We then ran the same test again, but this time we compressed the images to a small file size. The M2 Mac Mini took 6 minutes and 15 seconds, the M2 MacBook Air took 17 minutes and 52 seconds, so the Mac Mini was 2.85 times faster here, as the Air overheated and started throttling, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Really interesting that the M2 MacBook Pro was faster than the M2 Mac Mini here. So let's run a couple of more tests. So let's do some 3D rendering now. Using the CPU first in Blender, we use the classroom scene and the cycle CPU render. The M2 Mac Mini took 9 minutes and 53 seconds. The M2 MacBook Air took 14 minutes and 28 seconds. So the Mac Mini was 1.46 times faster, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 12 minutes and 41 seconds, so the Mac Mini was 1.28 times faster. So really nice improvement here, but now let's test out the GPUs. And we actually have some differences here. The M2 Mac Mini and the M2 MacBook Pro, they both have the unbinned 10-core version of the M2 GPU. The M2 MacBook Air has the bin version, which only comes with 8 cores. So the M2 Mac Mini took 3 minutes and 56 seconds, the M2 Air took 5 minutes and 55 seconds, so the Mac Mini was 1.5 times faster, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. So a very small difference from the Mac Mini. But yeah, the Mac Mini was still faster here. And we also tested Final Cut Pro using our 15-minute 4K project. This was one of our previous camera comparisons, and it was a very demanding project with loads of titles and effects, and this took the M2 Mac Mini 44 minutes and 29 seconds. I told you it was a very demanding project. The M2 Air took 50 minutes and 52 seconds, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 44 minutes and 2 seconds. So the Air was slower, but not massively slower. And that's because Final Cut doesn't push the CPU and GPU all the time, it simply does a bursty export depending on your project. Then we also tested the media engines by exporting an H.265 4K 5-minute clip into ProRes, and they should all be the same here as the media engines are identical. But the results were actually not. The M2 Mac Mini took 59 seconds, the M2 MacBook Air took 1 minute and 20 seconds, so the Mini was 1.35 times faster, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 1 minute and 13 seconds, so again the Mini was 1.23 times faster. We then ran the same test, but this time with a 6K 6-minute clip, and the Mac Mini took 1 minute and 33 seconds, compared to 2 minutes and 10 seconds on the MacBook Air, so the Mini was 1.4 times faster, and the M2 MacBook Pro took 2 minutes and 2 seconds, so the Mini was 1.3 times faster. So yeah, it looks like the media engines, although they are identical, we do get noticeably faster performance with the Mac Mini. And for all of you music producers out there, we also tested out Logic to see how many tracks you could play at the same time on each of these machines. And the Mac Mini could play 69 tracks, the MacBook Air could play 70, although after a while, I couldn't really play back those tracks smoothly, so it actually overheated. And the MacBook Pro could play also 69 tracks. Then of course we had to test some gaming, starting off with World of Warcraft, which is one of the very few Apple Silicon native games, which is really the best way to test true gaming performance on a Mac nowadays. So we set all of them to a resolution of 2560 by 1600 and ultra settings. Essentially, we set the graphics to as high as they could go. And the Mac Mini got between 43 to 50 frames per second. So that's an average of 46.5, which is very good for a $600 desktop. Keep in mind that once again the settings were maxed out. The M2 Air got between 35 to 42, so an average of 38.5, but the thing is, after 5 minutes, the Air started throttling heavily to about 20 frames per second or even lower, sometimes as low as 8. So yeah, the Air was just not suitable enough for gaming because of this. And the M2 MacBook Pro got between 38 to 45, so an average of 41.5, lower than the Mac Mini, but also sustained. And then we ran one more game, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is not a native Apple Silicon game, but it does use metals, so it is fairly optimized in that regard. We tested this at 2560 by 1600 on the MacBooks and 2560 by 1440 on the Mac Mini, as we couldn't really get 1600 because of our 16 by 9 aspect ratio monitor, so do keep this in mind. And here the Mac Mini got 18 frames per second, the Air got 13, and the MacBook Pro got 17, which would have likely been 18 or so with the low resolution of the Mac Mini. So in conclusion, the Mac Mini actually had better performance than both the M2 Air and the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro accessories, but the thing is you can upgrade those down the line whenever you want, really. And it's also very portable. You can still put it in your backpack. It is way more portable than something like a Mac Studio. So yeah, great job, Apple. This is what I would consider the best Mac ever made when it comes to what you get for your money. And if you want to save some money, there are some great deals on both the M2 and the M1 Mac Mini if you tap on the YouTube shoppable cards down below. But yeah, let me know, what do you guys think? I'm Daniel, it's been ZONExTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONExTECH signing out. Cheers.